As we are getting closer and closer to the end of this generation of gaming with the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Nintendo Wii, I've been looking back on my experiences on these systems. I've had a lot of fun times with these three systems, and I will continue to play with my PlayStation 3 for a while now until the price in the PlayStation 4 drops. But with that being said, I have to admit that I've had more negative experiences during this generation than positive. So I've gone ahead and created a list of 10 things that have been really bothering me during this generation. A lot of these things might be seen as personal preferences in gaming, but I do think that these are issues that pose a threat to the future of gaming. Number 10. Nintendo has lost their minds. We're gonna kickstart off this list with a problem that I think most people are aware of, and it seems to be a problem that has rolled over into this generation with the Wii U. Back during the 90s, Nintendo was king. Sure, Sega was a fierce and honorable rival, but Nintendo understood how gaming worked back then. They created great original content, made sure third-party content was available, and most titles based on existing licenses like Aladdin, Star Wars, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were given tender love and care. Nintendo stayed pretty consistent with this up until the GameCube, where you could tell Nintendo was beginning to lose third-party developers to systems like the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. But they still focused on making good games, and the GameCube has a very solid lineup of titles that hold up even to this day. All of that seemed to disappear completely when they released the Wii. Sure, for the first 2 years or so, most of us were captivated by the motion controls. It was a cool novelty, and the experience of swinging a Wii remote and defeating Ganondorf is one of those gaming experiences that I'm gonna take with me up until I'm 6 feet under. But that's the thing, it's a novelty and one that didn't last for very long. Truth of the matter is, the motion controls were unreliable, and made for frustrating experiences with any title that didn't have normal controls to fall back on. Mix in the fact that the Wii's lack of graphical power and online abilities, third-party developers started to back away faster than Sonic wearing a bunny hood. This left Nintendo in a bad state with having one of the most popular systems being sold at the time, and no one willing to make quality games for it. It opened up the floodgates for developers who wanted to make some quick zenny by making cheap and almost unplayable games, which buried the Wii U's library at the end of its life cycle. With the Wii U, this problem doesn't seem to be resolving itself anytime soon. Third party is slowly starting to come back, but nowhere near quickly enough as it should be for Nintendo to recover. It's getting to this point now where I would personally just like to see Nintendo to start making new games featuring their all-star characters on systems like the PlayStation and the Xbox. While a few games have tempted me to buy a Wii U, 3 games in particular, Hyrule Warriors, The Wonderful 101, and Smash Brothers, it does not justify buying a whole new system for me. I hate to see Nintendo disappear, but as time goes on, it's becoming more and more likely. Number 9, the indie boom. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but this growing population of independent developers needs to iron out a lot of its problems. But let's focus on the positives that need to be reinforced before we look into some of the problems. This boom is a wonderful growth for the video game industry. It's providing more jobs for this field than ever, and creative developers are finally getting a chance to create games that are truly unique and memorable without big studio interference. These games are getting more and more complex as time goes on, and it's fun to see what becomes of a lot of these studios. With that being said, there needs to be a better filter on what gets released to the markets like PSN and Xbox Live. There have been multiple titles that I have purchased, like Linger in Shadows, Journey, and Thomas Was Alone, where they do have interesting stories and experiences, but they take less than an hour to complete, or in Linger in Shadows' case, less than 30 minutes. While Linger in Shadows only cost about $5 when I got it, the other 2 games mentioned cost me around $20. Call me crazy, but for a game that has close to 0 replay value and can be beaten in less than an hour, I believe I should be getting more bang for my buck. When I bought Katamari Damacy on the PlayStation 2, I got it for $20 new at Best Buy within the first month of its release. I played it for months, unlocking content, replaying missions, and having a blast with the game in general. Now, there is a big difference between this game and the other 3 mentioned. and that's Katamari was released by Namco, but still, this is a budget title that did its job incredibly well. With Thomas's alone, it is a game that is entirely made up by two-dimensional squares with a single narrator and a bunch of easily solved platform puzzles that can be completed in an hour. There's no reason for this game to cost me anywhere close to $20 outside of putting money into the creator's pocket. Another issue I have is that a lot of these titles look like flash games that you'd find on Newgrounds for free. While I fully admit that I have no idea how a budget of a video game breaks down and where a lot of the money goes to, but I assume it costs a lot more to make a three-dimensional game than a two-dimensional one. So I have a very hard time seeing where a lot of my money is going to when I buy a lot of these indie games. Again, not all indie games are like this, and I do think that it is ultimately good for the industry as a whole, but as we go into this next generation of systems, we need a better management over what gets released and for what prices they need to be released at. Number 8. Sequelitis. I am very much aware that this is not a new problem as it's been around since the NES days, but with the PS3 and the 360 era, this problem seems to have exploded onto a whole new level. With series like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Halo, and so on, we're getting new additions to these series once every year now. Sure, to a degree, sports games make a little sense since you have the updated rosters, plays, and improvements to online play, but at a point it feels like overkill. But with a story-heavy series like Assassin's Creed, it makes no sense why we need to be getting a new chapter from this franchise year after year. As the years go on with this series, the story feels rushed and it makes less and less sense. I would prefer to wait more than 2 years, possibly 3, before getting a new addition to the series to give the creators some chance to develop something worthwhile and meaningful outside of the video game equivalency of a summer blockbuster. I don't want to spend too much time on this one since this is a pretty well-known complaint in the industry right now. P.S. Dear Capcom, either come out with Street Fighter V, a new Darkstalkers, or a new Rival Schools. Just stop remaking Street Fighter 4. I bought it once, and that was enough. We thought you went too far with the arcade edition, and Ultra is the 4th remake to this game. Stop it! Number 7. Open world games are too open. Before we get started, I want to admit that I do prefer linear games more than open world titles, and this might come off as a little bias. Exploration in games is an important feature to add, and when done correctly, it can offer a very rewarding experience, although this can lead to multiple problems when done very poorly. There are two extremes, either putting so much into your world that it distracts you from completing any of the main missions, or it's so empty that exploration is completely pointless and doesn't reward you for doing so. For the first of the two examples where I think exploration is done poorly is Skyrim. Now, before you leave those death threats in the comments, hear me out on this one. The world of Skyrim and the other Elder Scrolls games are so vast and filled with so many side quests, dungeons to explore, dragons to slay, potions to mix, houses to buy, guilds to join, and villagers to kill that I couldn't tell you what any of the main story of any of these games are. There's so much fluff to the game that it just seems unnecessary to me. None of these side missions felt fulfilling since I knew that there were going to be about 40 more of them that I needed to complete, and all of these missions would have nothing to do with the plot of the game. I don't see the point in doing any of them, and the entire game feels like a giant waste of time that's leading up to nothing. On the other hand, you have Grand Theft Auto, where the only thing you can do in the city is drive around, shoot harmless civilians, and cause general chaos. When you do come across something to do that isn't a main mission in a meh gangster story, it's boring as hell. If I wanted to play bowling, I'd go to a bowling alley. Same goes for playing pool or going out for a drive. Hell, even going out to a strip club is something I can do in my spare time, and I'd see actual nipples instead of pixels. Why should I do it virtually? What's worse is doing these extra activities doesn't really help you in any way during the course of the game. Again, like I said about Skyrim, it's meaningless fluff. While the causing general chaos can be a bit of fun, it all just seems so pointless to me. Now, for a series of games I think nail the exploration perfectly are going to be the Batman games. There's enough extra stuff to lengthen your playthrough that add to the story and experience, while making it very clear what your objectives are. So can open world games work? Yes, but I do believe it's overused and can cause more problems than it's worth. Number 6. Game rentals are a thing of the past.
But what about GameFly?
So many of you are screaming at your monitors right now. Well, here's the thing. GameFly doesn't work. I've had nothing but a terrible experience from them. It ultimately boils down to terrible customer service, never receiving the games I asked for, and having to wait over 4 months for a new game to become available.
Redbox does rentals too!
Yes, they do, and they are better than GameFly, but their options are so limited, I rarely ever use the service. What I'm referring to is going out to a video store, picking up a new game for about $10 or less, playing it for the weekend, and returning it to the store on Monday. This used to be a weekend routine for me as a kid, and I still believe it is the best way to play video games. While my family did buy a good amount of video games, we always made sure to rent them first so we never bought a game we didn't like, and it saved us a good bit of money in the long run too. With the death of mom and pop video rental stores and Blockbuster, this practice has almost completely disappeared. It lives on through these inferior methods mentioned before, but nothing beats the experience of going to a store, selecting a title for a reasonable price. But rentals are starting to disappear altogether because of download-only titles. As we move closer and closer to this new generation, a giant selection of the gaming library is going to only be released digitally, meaning no discs for companies like GameFly or Redbox to rent out. Meaning, the only way to try out a new game, assuming there's no demo, which is another thing that's starting to disappear, is to buy it outright. As for someone who believes in the try before you buy method, I see this as extremely unfair and risky. A personal experience I've had with this recently was with a game I really wanted to play called Saint Seiya Brave Soldiers. I saw it was released on the PSN for about $60, and I assumed because of its large price tag, the game was going to have a disc version I could pick up used and save a little bit of money. So I looked around and finally came to the conclusion that it was a download-only title. And it made sense since it was based around an anime series that didn't do very well in America, but I held off for the longest time because of its large price tag. When the PSN had their anime sale a little while ago, I got it for about $15, and I regret buying it because the game was bland and boring. Assuming this game had come out on a disc and I had rented it, I would have just chalked it up as a mediocre rental. But if I had bought the game full price, I would be calling the PSN asking for my money back. But considering that there was no other way for me to play this game, I wasn't left with much of a choice outside of waiting for it to go on sale. There needs to be a workaround for this, but I have no idea what it would be. Although I do know that trial periods on the PSN are not the way to go. Downloading the full game and only playing it for an hour is not a rental. It's a demo that takes up way too much room on your hard drive. Number 5. Adding multiplayer where it doesn't belong. One of the best things to come out of this last generation is the leaps and bounds it made in terms of its online play. It made joining up with a random group just as easy as joining up with your friends in a private game. This feature has brought so much success to this generation, and it's the thing that most people seem to enjoy out of its run. The problem with this is that every developer wanted to cash in on this growing trend. Games started to pop up everywhere with additional modes for multiplayer where the game clearly did not call for it. Games like God of War, Mario, Resident Evil, Ratchet & Clank, Metal Gear Solid, and Fable are all games that were made for the purpose of single player, and they were given shoddy co-op or multiplayer modes that did not fit into the game. The multiplayer experiences of these games were frustrating, and it made you question having friends at all. Some games work great for multiplayer, but if you're not a racer, a fighter, a first-person shooter, a party game, an arcade-style beat-em-up, or Metal Slug, then you shouldn't be forcing your players to argue with each other about who's going to be using the catsuit power-up and which platform to jump onto next. The worst example of this by far was the quote, 2-player co-op mode, unquote, on Broken Sword, the director's cut on the Wii. For those unfamiliar with the Broken Sword series, it's a point-and-click adventure game, where you move the cursor around the screen to solve puzzles and point the character in the direction he needs to go to. So for the Wii's version of this game, they added a co-op mode, which consists of having player 1 playing the game normally, while player 2 gets a second cursor to move around on the screen. The problem is, the second player was not allowed to control anything, just point at things on the screen. It's basically the equivalency of having your buddy sit next to you on the couch, pointing at the screen with his finger. It's completely pointless and barely qualifies as a 2-player experience, since all player 2 is doing is watching player 1 play the game. I have a feeling that this gameplay mode would have not have been created if the multiplayer trend wasn't as popular as it is. Number 4, dressing up a clone. This is going to be another one of those things that's going to get a lot of people angry, but I could really care less, so here it goes. Injustice is just a Mortal Kombat clone. I have a lot of issues with this game, but the biggest one is that its gameplay offers nothing new that hasn't been done in previous entries of the Mortal Kombat series. They pretty much just changed the skins of the characters to wear DC superhero outfits. There is nothing about the gameplay that is impressive in any way, shape, or form. That and the story sucks, but that's another issue for another day. But my point is this, a lot of games during this generation were just clones of games that came before it. Uncharted is Tomb Raider with a male lead and characters that are nowhere near as likable. Infamous is just Sly Cooper with an unlikable lead. Azuma's Wrath is a modern day take on Dragon's Lair's gameplay. Ghostbusters the video game is just a gritty remake of Luigi's Mansion. And to finish off my list of examples, Tron Evolution was a terrible Prince of Persia ripoff. There are many more examples to be given, but at this point I think you get the point. And we didn't even touch on all the Dynasty Warrior clones. It's one thing to remake a game for a new generation of gamers, but when you're just copying elements from a previous game and trying to pass them off as your own original work, it makes me angry. It can be hard to come up with an original concept for a video game, I understand that, but we need something better. I want actual original IPs from this next generation, not Mario dressed up in a blue hedgehog suit. Number 3, most games look identical. One of my favorite things about the PlayStation 1 and 2 era is most of the games had a very unique look to them. This was mostly to get around the low polygon count, but these games had style. Rarely did any two games look like one another, but this generation had the exact opposite problem. With the much higher graphics capabilities of the 360 and the PlayStation 3, developers were able to achieve a more realistic look for their games than ever before. At first it was cool just to see the high level of graphics being used in a playable video game, but much like the motion controls for the Wii, the novelty wore off. Yes, everything looks great, but there are only so many different ways you can make a jungle look like a jungle, or a city look like a city. It's not just the backgrounds either, it's also the character designs. We've gotten so many main characters who look like plain old white dudes with shaved heads at this point that it's nuts. There needs to be more thought put into these designs because the only thing I can use to tell them apart from one another are their jackets. It tells me nothing about their character, which is a pretty good reflection since a lot of these characters had the personality of wallpaper anyway. The most impressive character design I can think of from this last generation of games was Azuma from Azuma's Wrath, and that was mostly because he had 6 arms. This hyper-realistic look needs to be substituted for more style. Thankfully, games like No Man's Sky, Rime, and Battleborn look to be changing that, but I'm hoping these are going to be the norms and not freak accidents. Number 2, DLC turns games into money pits. Remember when you used to buy a game and it came complete? It's been way too long since that's happened. It seems every game being released nowadays has downloadable content attached to it. Sometimes it might be something as silly as new costumes that cost about $1 per suit, but then you get the ones like Azura's Wrath, where you have to buy additional content in order to get the ending of the game, which is a giant dick move on the developer's part. I shouldn't have to pay to see the ending of a game that I already paid for in the first place. Regardless, additional content purchases are completely unnecessary. I want to work for my unlockables, not buy them. It's cheap when you do it that way. It's far more satisfying as a gamer to unlock a new character or a new map. I know it's an old-fashioned way of thinking now, but it beats having to pay $20 for something you're only going to tinker with once in a game that you already paid $60 for. But the worst case of endlessly throwing money into a game was easily Rock Band and Guitar Hero. It's bad enough we had to pay for additional knickknacks to play the games properly in the first place, but having to pay for songs that we actually wanted to play was terrible. Sure, some of these games had a strong song list to choose from at the beginning, but how else was I supposed to play Stan Bush's The Touch on Rock Band without having to buy it on DLC? Personally, I spent about 3 times more on the additional songs than what I spent on the actual game. It just became that game I kept throwing money at. And sure, it's fun to play, and I spent well over $200 on this one, but the thing is, I could have spent that money buying a whole nother system instead of Billy Joel's top 20 hits. But that's how they're designing games now, so that we'll have to buy all the DLC if we want to get a complete experience. It's greedy and it rarely benefits the game. The sad thing is though, this looks like a problem that's only going to get worse as time goes on. And my number one complaint from this last generation of gaming goes to developers need to make games, not movies. My biggest issue from games from this last generation have been that cutscenes have been far more impactful than the game itself. So much so that segments of the game are just turning into action movie sequences that need to be played in a certain way, otherwise you'll die and have to restart the scene over. These scripted events are just overbearing at times. Part of the fun of playing a video game is choosing your own way to solve a problem or figuring out the game's mechanics to solve a puzzle. The scripted events take away the fun of solving the problem on your own. Games like Uncharted and The Last of Us are the biggest offenders of holding your hand throughout the game and never letting go. Not once during any of these games did I actually feel as though I had control over the character. I felt like I was just embodying a bland white dude as the game kept forcing me to go forward while explosions were happening in the background to distract you. It feels like I'm watching a movie, and not in a good way. In these games, I have no control over the story, no control over what happens to the characters, and no control over the action. It's boring, and the story isn't good enough to get me invested into any of the situations that's happening. Because of this, I find it completely ludicrous that they're even considering turning these games into movies, because that's what they already are. These aren't video games, they're movies that the game tricks you into thinking that you have control over what's happening. Sure, games like Final Fantasy, Devil May Cry, God of War, or even Zelda are the same in that regard, where regardless of your actions in the game, you have no say in what happens in the story. But here's the thing, they're actual games that you can decide on how things play out in the game. Zelda doesn't tell you how to solve its puzzles. God of War and Devil May Cry don't tell you what combos you need to do in order to defeat the enemies, and Final Fantasy doesn't tell you how to level up your characters and organize your party. That's what you control, and that's what makes you feel like you're playing part of the story. Hell, Call of Duty does a great job of making you feel like a soldier in a war zone, even though it barely has anything to classify as a story. Developers have forgotten that we need to be able to control these characters, not be controlled by them and their environments. I'm tired of the bike chases where I have to dodge explosions in a certain order, and if I don't, I have to restart at the beginning of the scene to dodge the same explosions. It's repetitive and annoying. Same goes for the stealth titles where I need to take out the guards in a certain order, and if I deviate from the order that the game sets up, it just straight up kills me for trying to play the game differently. Action sequences like these only work in movies or games done by Telltales, where the quick-time events depend heavily on the outcome of the fight, and you have actual control over how the character acts. But this goes back to the problem of making the graphics too realistic. Instead of making a realistic game, they're focusing on making a semi-realistic movie. Instead of hiring actors, they're using computer-generated images of a dopey indie knockoff to push around in their action scenes, and instead of having the balls to release a fully CGI movie in theaters targeted for adults, they're passing it off as a video game and charging $60 per ticket. These games have no replay value. While a good action movie can be rewatchable, these types of games only have the lifespan of one playthrough. It's so long, boring, and repetitive that by the time it's over, I'm just ready to smash the disc and play an actual game, like Mario or Pong. So, those are my top 10 things I hate about this last generation of gaming. Hopefully things will change for the better, but who am I to say? And just to clarify, this is a personal list, so feel free to say that I'm wrong. If you think so, please let me know. I'm always up for a good conversation.